This episode of Serverless Chats is sponsored by CBT Nuggets and Lumigo. On this episode, I chat with Patrick Strzelec about building a banking platform with serverless. This is Serverless Chats, episode number 105. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Daly, and this is Serverless Chats. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Strzelec. Hey, Patrick. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So you are a lead developer at NorthOne. So I'd love it if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and what NorthOne does.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, I'm a lead developer here at NorthOne. I've been sort of focusing on building out our GraphQL gateway here, as well as some of our serverless microservices. And yeah, so what NorthOne does, we are a banking experience for small businesses. So effectively, we are a deposit account with many integrations that act almost like an operating system for small businesses. So basically, we choose the best partners we can to do things like check deposits, just do regular transactions you would do, as well as any kind of insights, and the use cases will grow. I'd like to call us sort of a very tailored banking experience for small businesses.
Very nice. And the thing that is fascinating, I think, about this is that you have just like completely embraced serverless, right?
Yeah, totally. We started off early on with this vision of being fully event driven, and we started off with a monolith, sort of like a Python Django big monolith, and we've been experimenting with serverless all the way through. And somewhere along the journey, we decided this is a tool for us, and it just totally made sense on the business side, on the tech side. It's just been it's been absolutely great.
So let's talk about that, because this is one of those things where I think you get a business, and I mean a business that's that's a banking platform, right? So I mean you're here, you're handling some serious transactions here. You've got a lot of transactions that are going through, and you totally embrace this. And I'd love to kind of have you take the listeners through why you thought it was a good idea, like what were the business cases for it, and then we can talk a little bit about the adoption process, and then I know there's a whole bunch of stuff that you did with event-driven stuff, which is absolutely fascinating, and then we can probably follow up with maybe a couple of challenges and some of the issues you sort of face. So why don't we start there? Let's start like who in your organization, because I'm always fascinated to know, if somebody is like in your organization says, hey, we absolutely need to do serverless, and just starts beating that drum. So what was sort of that business and technical case that made your organization sort of swallow that pill?
Yeah, totally. So I think just at a high level, we're a user experience company. Like we want to make sure we offer small businesses the best banking experience possible. So we don't want to spend a lot of time on operations, and trying to, and also reliability is incredibly important. So if we can offload that burden and move faster, that's what we need to do. And so when we're talking about who's beating that drum, I would say our VP Blake really early on seemed to see serverless as this amazing fit. So I joined about 3 years ago today, so I guess this is my anniversary at the company, and we were just deciding what to build. And at the time, there was a lot of architecture diagrams, and Blake sort of hypothesized that serverless was a great fit. We had a lot of versions of the world, some with Apache Kafka and a bunch of microservices going through there. There's other versions with serverless in the mix, and some of the tooling around that. And this other hypothesis that maybe we want GraphQL gateway in the middle of there. And so it was one of those things that we wanted to sort of test our hypothesis as we go, and that kind of ties into this innovation velocity that that serverless allows for. So it's very cheap to put a new piece of infrastructure up in serverless. I mean, just the other day we wanted to test Kinesis for an event streaming use case, and that was just a half an hour to set up that config, and you could put it live in
Right.
production and test it out, which is completely awesome. And so I think like that innovation velocity was sort of the hypothesis. We could just try things out really quickly. They don't cost much at all. You only pay for what you use for the most part. And so
Right.
we were able to sort of try that out, as well as reliability. So AWS really does a good job of making sure everything's available all the time, something that
Right.
maybe a young startup isn't ready to take on. And so yeah, so when I joined the company, Blake kind of proposed like, okay, let's try out, GraphQL as a gateway, as a concept. Build me a prototype. And in that prototype, there was a really good opportunity to try serverless. They just Apollo Server launched this serverless package that was just super easy to deploy. Like it was a complete no-brainer. We tried it out, we built the case, and so we just started with this GraphQL gateway running on serverless. So AWS Lambda, and it's kind of funny because at first it's like, okay, we're just trying this out in development. Nobody's going to be hitting our services. It
Right.
was still a year out from when we were going into production, and but like once we went into prod, this Lambda's hot all the time. There, which is kind of interesting. I think like that the cost case kind of breaks down there because you're running this thing forever. But it was
Right.
this GraphQL server in front of our Python Django monolith with this vision of event-driven microservices, which just fit well for banking. If you just think about the banking world, everything is pretty much eventually consistent. Just that's
Right.
the way the systems are designed. You send out a transaction, it doesn't settle for a while. And so we were always going to do event driven, but when you're starting out with a team of 3 developers, you're not going to build this whole microservices environment and
Right.
everything. And so yeah, we started with that monolith with the GraphQL gateway in front, which scaled pretty nicely because we were able to sort of, even today we have the same GraphQL gateway. We just changed the services backing it, which was
Right.
which was really
Right.
sweet. And so yeah, so like the adoption process was like, let's try it out. We tried it out with GraphQL first, and then as we were heading into launch, we had this monolith that we needed to manage. And I mean, managing AWS resources, I mean, it's easier than back in the day when you're managing your own virtual machines and stuff, but it's still
Right.
not
Right.
great. And we,
Right.
we didn't have a lot of time, and there's a lot of last minute changes we needed to make. So a big refactor to our scheduling transactions functions kind of happened right before launch. And so that was like an amazing serverless use case. I think that was our second one,
Yeah.
where we're like, okay, we need to get this live really quickly. And we created this worker foreman pattern really quickly as a test with serverless, and it worked beautifully. We also had another use case come up, which was just a simple phone scheduling service. We just wrapped an
Hmm.
API and just exposed some endpoints, but it was just a lot easier to do with serverless. You just threw it off to 2 developers, figure out
Right.
how you do it, and it was ready to be live.
Yeah,
And then,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I kind of want to get to this point because you're talking about standing up infrastructure using infrastructure as code or the
yeah,
tools you're using. I mean, how many developers were working on this thing?
how
Like,
many? I think at the time, like maybe four developers on backend functionality before launch, like when we were just starting out.
right, but you're building. I mean, you're building a banking platform here, right?
Yeah,
So, I mean, this is pretty sophisticated. So, I mean, I can imagine another business case for serverless is just the sense that we don't have to hire an operations team.
yeah, exactly. We were well through launch. Like I think it would have been, a couple months where we were live, where we hired our first DevOps engineer,
Right.
which is incredible. I mean, our VP took a lot of that too. Like I'm sure he had his hands a little more dirty than he'd like early on, but yeah, it was just amazing. We were able to manage all that infrastructure, and scale was never a concern. I mean, in your
Right.
early stages, maybe it shouldn't be just yet, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was just really, really easy.
So now you started with like four, and I think what are you now, like somewhere around 25 developers, somewhere in that space now?
Yeah. So about 25 developers now. We're growing really fast. So we doubled this year during COVID, which is just crazy to think about.
Yeah.
Um, and somehow have been scaling somewhat smoothly, at least in terms of like just being able to output as a dev team remote. And we'll probably double again this year. So this is maybe where I shamelessly plug that we're hiring, and we always are. And you could visit northone.com and just check out the careers page, or just hit me up for a warm intro. But yeah, like it's been crazy, and that's like one of the things that serverless has helped with us too. We haven't had this you know scaling bottleneck, which is an operations team.
Right.
So we don't need to hire X operations people for a certain number of developers, and onboarding has been easier. There was one example of during like a major project, we hired a developer. He was new to serverless, but just a very experienced developer, and he had a production ready serverless service ready in a month, which was
Wow.
like just an insane ramp up time. I haven't seen that very often, and no, he didn't have to talk to any of our operation staff. And we've already used serverless long enough that we had sort of all of our presets and boilerplates ready, and
Right.
permissions kind of locked down. So it's just super easy, super empowering just for him to be able to just play around with the different services. Because we hit that point where we've invested enough that every developer, when they open a branch, that branch deploys it as its own stage, which has all of the services,
Love it.
AWS infrastructure deployed. So you might have a PR open that launches like an instance of Kinesis, and 5 SQS and 10 lambdas, and a bunch of other things, and then tear it down almost immediately. And the
Right.
cost isn't something we really worry about. Uh, so yeah, the innovation velocity there has been really, really good. And just being able to try things out. So if you're thinking about something like Kinesis, where it's sort of like a Kafka, that's my understanding.
Mhm.
And if you think about the organizational buy-in you need for something like Kafka, because you need to support it, come up with opinions, and all this
Right.
other stuff, um, you'll spend weeks trying it out. But one of our developers was like, "This seems great. We're streaming events. We want this to be real time. Let's just try it out." And this was for our analytics use case, and it's live in production now. It seems to be doing the thing, and we're
Yeah.
testing out that use case, and there isn't that roadblock. And you could always switch off to a different design if you want. So yeah, the experimentation piece there has been awesome. Like we've changed, during major projects, we've changed the way we've thought about our resources a few times, and in the end, it works out. And often it is about resiliency. It's just
Right.
jamming queues into places we didn't think about in the first place. But yeah, that's been
But
awesome.
so I'm curious with that though. So with 25 developers, I mean, Kinesis for the most part works pretty well, but you do have to watch those iterator ages and make sure that they're not, backing up, or that you're losing events if they get, if they get flooded or whatever. And also sticking queues everywhere sounds like a really good idea, and I'm a big fan of that. But that means there's a lot of queues you have to manage and
Yep.
watch and set alarms on and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just curious. I mean, then you also talked about a pretty, what sounds like a pretty great CI/CD process to spin up new branches and things like that. So there's a lot of DevOpsy ops work that is still there.
Mhm.
And so how are you handling that now? Do you have dedicated ops people, or do you just have your developers kind of looking after that piece of it?
Yeah, I'd say we have a very spirited group of developers who are inspired. So yeah, we do a lot of our code sharing via internal packages. So a few of our developers just figured out some of our patterns that we need, whether it's like CI, or how we structure our event stores, or how we do our queue subscriptions. And so we manage these internal packages. This won't scale well, by the way. This is just us being inspired, and trying to reduce some of this burden. So it is
Right.
interesting. Like I've listened to this podcast and a few others, and this idea of like infrastructure as code being part of every developer's toolbox. It's starting to really resonate with our team. In our migration, or our shift to full, I'd say, doing serverless properly,
Mm-hmm.
we've learned to really think in terms of infrastructure when we're creating solutions.
Yeah.
So not saying we're doing serverless the right way now, but we certainly did it the wrong way in the past, where we've had this, we would spin up, a bunch of API gateways that would talk to each other. A lot of REST
Right.
calls going around this
Right.
spider web of communication. Also, I'll call these monster lambdas that have a whole procedure list
Right.
that they need to get through and a lot of points of failure. And so when we were thinking about the way we're going to do Lambda now, we try to keep one Lambda doing one thing, and then there's pieces of infrastructure stitching that together.
Yeah.
So event bridge between domain boundaries, SQS for commands where we can instead
Right.
of using API gateway. Um, yeah, and I think that sort of transitions pretty well into um, our big break. So I'm talking about this as our migration to serverless. So I'd want to talk
Right.
more about that. So
Well, before we jump into that, I just want to kind of ask this question about because again, I call those fat. Some people call them fat lambdas. I call them lambda lists. I think there's lambda lists, then
yeah,
fat lambdas, then your sort of single purpose functions. But so it's interesting again moving towards that direction, and I think it's super important that just admitting that you're like we were definitely doing this wrong because I think so many companies find that adopting serverless is very much so an evolution, and it's a learning thing where the teams have to figure out what works for them, and in some cases discovering best practices on your own. So I think that's that you've gone through that process. I think is great. So definitely kudos to you for that. Hi, everyone. I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, CBT Nuggets. If you're an IT professional or a developer like me, you know how important it is to constantly be learning new skills to keep up with the latest trends. Now, sometimes a blog post or a YouTube tutorial can get you started, but if you really want to upskill, nothing compares to professional training from experts you can trust. With CBT Nuggets, I have access to more than 400 courses and 4,000 hours of professional training, and with a 100% in-house training team, they add 40 hours of new training every week. Their courses feature topics ranging from building serverless apps with Lambda and DynamoDB to certification-focused training for AWS, Microsoft, Linux, and more. CBT Nuggets also offers virtual labs so that you can practice your new skills as you're learning them. And they have accountability coaching, which lets you talk to a real person to create a customized learning plan to set goals and keep you accountable. Whether you're a developer looking to sharpen your skills or a team looking to level up together, you can try CBT Nuggets for free for 7 days thanks to their free trial offer. Just visit cbtnuggets.com/serverless and sign up to get started. So before we get into, though, sort of that adoption and the migration or the evolution process that you kind of went through to get to where you are now, I mean, one other sort of business or technical case for serverless, especially with something as complex as banking, like I think, I still don't understand why I can't transfer personal money or money from my personal TD bank account to my wife's local checking account, like why that's so hard to do. But it seems like there's a lot of steps, like steps that have to work. Like you can't get halfway through 5 steps in some sort of transaction and then be like, oops, we can't go any further. I mean, you have to roll that back and things like that. So I would imagine orchestration is a huge piece of this as well.
yeah, 100%. The banking lends itself really well to these workflows. I'll call them. So if you're thinking about even just the start of any banking process, there's this whole application process where you put in all your personal information, you send off a request to your bank, and then now there's this whole waterfall of things that needs to happen, all kinds of checks and making sure people aren't on any fraud lists or money laundering lists, or even just getting a second eye from our compliance department. And there's a lot of steps there, and even just keeping our own systems in sync
Right.
with our auth provider and other places. So we definitely lean on using step functions a lot. I think they work really, really well for our use case. And so, yeah, just the visual, being able to see this is where a customer is in their onboarding journey is very, very powerful, and being able to sort of restart at any point of there, or even just giving our compliance team a view into that process, or even adding like a pause portion. I think that's one of the biggest
Right.
wins there, is that we could process somebody through any one of our pipelines, and there we may need a human eye there, at least for this point in time. And so that's one of the interesting things about the banking industry, is that there are still manual processes behind the
Mm.
scenes, and there are I find this term funny, but there are wire rooms in banks where there are people reviewing things and all that. So there are a lot of workflows that just lend themselves well to step functions. And yeah, so yeah, that pausing capability and being able to return later with a
Right.
response. So that allows you to build, other internal applications for your compliance teams and other teams, where it just behind the scenes calls back and says, okay, resume this waterfall.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think that was the visualization, especially in an events world, when you're talking about um, like sagas. I guess it's like we're talking about distributed transactions here in a way,
Right.
where
Absolutely.
there's a lot of things happening, and a common pattern now is the saga pattern. Or you probably don't want to be doing two-phase commits and all this other stuff, but when we're looking at sagas, it's sort of like the orchestration you could do, or the choreography. And choreography gets very messy because there's a lot of implicit behavior. I'm a service, and I know what I need to do when these events come through, and I know which compensating events I need to dump, and all this other stuff. But
Right.
now there's very limited view. Like if a developer is trying to gain context in a certain domain and understand the chain of events, although you are decoupled, there's still this extra coupling now of having to understand what's going on in your system, and being able to share it with external stakeholders. So
Right.
using step
Right.
functions, that's that, I guess, the serverless way of doing orchestration. And so yeah, and just being able to share that view. So we had this process where we needed to move a lot of accounts to, or a lot of user data to a different system, and we
Hmm.
were able to just use an orchestrator there as well, just to keep an eye on everything that's going on.
Right.
um, so we might be paused in migrating. um, let's say we're moving over contacts, a transaction list, and one other thing. You could visualize which one of those are in the red and which one we need to um, come in and fix, and also share that progress with external stakeholders. Yeah, and also it makes for fun launch parties. I'd say, like, when it's kind of funny, because when developers do their job, you press a button and everything launches, and there's not really anything to
Right.
share or show.
There's no
But
like balloons or anything like that.
yeah, but it was kind of cool to look at these, like, oh, customers flowing through this branch of the logic,
Yeah,
and no,
that's
it's all
awesome.
green. And then I think one of the coolest things was just the retriability as well. When somebody does fail, or yeah, when one of these workflows fails, you could see exactly which step. You can see the logs and
Right.
all that. I think the one of the challenges we ran into there, though, was because we are working in the banking space. There, we're dealing with sensitive data, and
Right.
something I almost wish AWS solved out of the box would be being able to obfuscate some of that data. And maybe you can't, I'm not sure, but we have to think of patterns for tokenization, for instance.
Hmm.
Stripe does this a lot, where certain parts of their platform, you put in personal information, you get back a token, and you use that reference everywhere. So we
Right.
do tokenization, as well as we limit the amount of details flowing through steps in our orchestrators. So we'll use an event store with identifiers flowing through, and we'll be
Yeah.
doing reads back to that event store in between steps to do what we need to do.
Right.
So you lose some of that debuggability. You can't see exactly what information is flowing through, but we need to keep user
Right.
data safe.
Well, because it's the use case for it, right? Yeah. I mean, and
Yeah.
I think that you mentioned a good point about sort of orchestration versus choreography, and I'm a big fan of choreography when it makes sense. But I think one of the hardest lessons you learn when you start building distributed systems is knowing when to use choreography and knowing when to use orchestration. And certainly in banking, orchestration is super important. And again, like with those saga patterns built in, that's the kind of thing where you can get to a point in the process, and you don't even need to do automated rollbacks. Like you can get to a failure failure state, and then from there that can be a pause, and then you can essentially kick off the unwinding of those things and do some of that. So and I love that idea of the token, token pattern, and using, just rehydrating certain steps where you need to. And I think that makes a ton of sense. So, all right, so let's move on to the adoption and sort of the migration process, because I know this is something that really excites you, and it should, because it is cool. Like I always know, as you're building out applications and you start to add more capabilities and more functionality and start really embracing serverless as a methodology, then it can get really exciting. So, so let's take a step back. You had a champion in your organization that was sort of beating the drum, like, let's try this. This is going to make a lot of sense. You build a Apollo Lambda, or a Lambda running Apollo server on it, and you are sort of using that as like a strangler pattern, like routing all your stuff through now to your back end. So what happens? What happens next?
Yeah. So I would say when we needed to build new features, developers just gravitated towards using serverless. It was just easier. We were using TypeScript instead of Python, which we just tend to like as an organization, and so it's just easier to hop into TypeScript land. But I think it was just easier to get something live, and so now we had all these lambdas popping up and doing their job, but I think the problem that happened was we weren't using them properly. Also, there was a lot of difference between each of our serverless setups.
Yeah.
And so we would learn each time, and we'd be like, okay, we'll use this parser function here to simplify some of it, because it is very bare bones if you're just pulling the serverless framework. And it took a little, yeah. So every service looked very different, I would say. And also, we never really took the time to sit back and say, okay, how do we think about this? How do we use what serverless gives us to enable us, instead of it just being like an easy thing to spin up? I think that's where it started. It was just easy to start, but we didn't embrace it fully. And I remember having a conversation at some point with our VP being like, hey, how about we just put Express into one of our Lambdas and we create this now I know it's a Lambda lift. I was like, it would just be easier. Everybody knows how to use Express. Why don't we just do this? Why are we writing our own parsers for all these things? And we have like 10 versions of a make response helper function that was copy pasted between repos, and we didn't really have a good pattern for sharing that code yet in private packages. So yeah, we realized we liked serverless, but we realized we needed to do it better. And so we started with having a serverless chapter meeting between some of our team members, and we made some moves there. We created a shared boilerplate at some point. So it sort of reduced some of the differences you'd see between some of our repositories. But it's still, we needed like a step change difference in our thinking when I look back. And we sort of got lucky that opportunity came up. So, at this point, we probably had another 6 Lambda services, maybe more actually. I want to say we'd probably have around 15 services at this point, without sort of a governing body around patterns. And so at this time, we had this interesting opportunity where we found out we're going to be replatforming. And so a big announcement we just made last month was that we moved on to a new bank partner called Bancorp. And so the bank partner that supports Chime, and they're sort of like, I'll call them an engine boost. We put in a much larger, more efficient engine for our small businesses. If you just look at the capabilities they provide, they're just absolutely amazing. It's what we need to build forward. Their events API is amazing, as well as just their base banking capabilities. The unit economics they can offer, the times on their things were just better. So we found out we're doing an engine swap. And so the people on the business side in our company trusted our technical team to sort of do what we needed to do. Obviously, we need to put together a case, but they trusted us to choose our technology, which was awesome. I think we just had a really good track record of delivering. And so we sort of had free reign to decide what do we do. But the timeline was tight. And so what we decided to do, this was COVID times too, is a few of our developers got COVID tested, and we we rented a house and we did a bubble situation, kind of how in the NHL or NBA you have like a bubble. We had a dev bubble,
The all-star
which
team.
the all-star
Yeah.
team, yeah. And so we decided, let's sit down, let's figure out what patterns are going to take us forward. How do we make the step change at the same time as like step change in our technology stack at the same time as we're swapping out this this engine essentially for the business. And so in this house, we watched almost every YouTube video you can imagine on event driven and serverless. And I think leading up, I think just knowing that we were going to be doing this, I think all of us independently started prototyping and watching videos and
Right. Yeah.
reading a lot of your content and Alex Debris and Yanchui. We all had a lot of ideas already going in. And so when we all got to this house, we started off with this exercise, this event storming exercise, which is kind of popular in the domain driven design community, where we just threw down our entire business on a wall with sticky notes. And it would have been better to have every business stakeholder there, but luckily we had two people from our product team there as representatives. That's how invested we were in building this out, right? That we had product sitting in the room with us to figure it out. And so we slapped down our entire business on a wall. This took days, and then drew circles around it and iterated on that for a while, and then started looking at what the technology looks like. What are our domain boundaries, and what prototypes do we need to make? And so for a few weeks there, we were just prototyping. We built out what I'd call baby's first balance. That was the running joke, where how do we get an account opened with a balance, with the transactions minimally, with some new patterns. And so we really embraced some of this domain-driven design thinking, as well as just event-driven thinking. And so when we were rethinking our architecture, three concepts became very important for us. Not entirely new, but important. So idempotency was a big one.
Right.
Dealing with distributed transactions was another one of those, as well as eventual consistency. And the eventual consistency portion is kind of funny because we were already doing it a lot. Like our transactions wouldn't always settle very quickly. We didn't know about it, but now our whole system becomes eventually consistent. Typically, if you now divide all of your architecture across domains and decouple everything. And so so we created some early prototypes. We created our own version of an event store, which is I would just say an opinionated schema around DynamoDB, where we keep track of revisions, payload, timestamp, all the things you'd want to be able to do event sourcing. That's another thing we sort of decided on. Event sourcing seemed like the right approach for state for a lot of our use cases. Banking, I mean, if you just think about a banking ledger, it is event sourced, or an accounting ledger. You're just adding up rows, add, subtract. And so, we created a lot of prototypes for these things. And so, our event store pattern became basically just a DynamoDB with opinions around the schema, as well as a package, a shared code package with a simple dispatch function, one dispatch function that really looks at enforcing optimistic concurrency, and one that's like a little bit more relaxed. And then we also had some of our some reducer functions built into there.
Right.
That was one of the packages that we created, as well as another prototype around that was like, how do we create the actual subscriptions to this event store? And so we landed on SNS to SQS fan out, and it seems like fan out first is the serverless way of doing a lot of things. And so we sort of learned that along the way, and it makes sense. It was one of those things we read from a lot of these blogs and YouTube videos, and it really made sense in production when all the data is streaming from one place, and then now you just add subscribers all over the place, just new queues. And so fan out first, highly recommend. We just kind of landed on there by following best practices.
Right. So okay, so you mentioned a bunch of different things in there, which is awesome. But so you get together in this house, you come up with all the events, you do this event storming session, which is always a great exercise, right? And so you get a pretty good visualization of how the business is going to run from an event standpoint. So then you start building out this event driven architecture, and you mentioned some packages that you built. We talked about step functions and the orchestration piece of this. So so just give me a quick overview of the actual system itself. So you said it's backed by DynamoDB, but then you have a bunch of packages that run in between there, and then there's a whole bunch of queues, and then you're using some custom packages. I think I already said that, but you're using I use an event bridge in there. Like what's some of the architecture behind all that?
Yeah, really, really good question. So once we created these domain boundaries, we needed to figure out how do we communicate between domains and within domains. And we landed on really differentiating milestone events and domain events. And so I guess milestone events in other terms might be called integration events, but this idea that these are key business milestones. An account was open, an application was approved or rejected, things that every domain may need to know about. And then within our domains, our domain boundaries, we had these domain events, which might reduce to a milestone event. And we could maintain those contracts in the future and change those up. So we needed to think about how do we message all these things across? Like, how do we communicate? And so we landed on Event Bridge for our milestone events. So we have one event bus for that we talk to all of our between domain boundaries, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have and so yeah, so Event Bridge there, and then each of our services now subscribe to that Event Bridge and maintain their own event store. And so that's backed by DynamoDB. So each of our services have their own data store. It's usually an event stream or a projection database, but it's almost all Dynamo, which is interesting because our old platform used Postgres and we did have relational data. So it was interesting. I was really scared at first, like how are we going to maintain relations and
Right.
things? And it became a non-issue. I don't even know why now that I think about it. Just like every service maintains its nice projection through events and
Right.
builds its own view of the world, which brings its own problems. And so we have DynamoDB in there, and then SNS to SQS fan out. And then when we're talking about
That's off the
packages, we just
stream. That's off the streams.
exactly, yeah. So
Yeah.
we're Dynamo streams to SNS to SQS. And then we use shared code packages to make those subscriptions very easy. So if you're looking at doing that SNS to SQS fan out or just creating SQS queues, there is a lot of CloudFormation boilerplate that we were creating, and we need to move really quick on this project. So we got pretty opinionated quick, and we created our own subscription function that just generates all this CloudFormation with naming conventions, which was nice. I think the opinions were good because early on, we weren't opinionated enough, I would say. And when you look in
Right.
your AWS dashboard, the resources aren't prefixed correctly, and there's all this garbage. So you're able to
Yeah.
have consistent naming throughout, make it really easy to subscribe to an event. And so we would publish packages to help with certain things. So our event store package was one of those. We also created a Lambda handlers package, which leverages, there's like a Lambda middleware's compose package out there, which is quite nice. And we basically all the common functionality we're doing a lot of, like parsing a body from S3 or
Right.
SQS or
Right.
API gateway. That's just a middleware that we now publish. Validation in and out. We highly recommend the library Zod. We really embraced it. TypeScript first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, object validation, really, really cool package. And so we created all these middlewares now. Event subscription packages. So we have like a lot of shared code in this internal npm repository that we install across. And I think one challenge we had there was eventually you're abstracted away too much from the CloudFormation,
Mm.
and it's hard for new developers to. It's easy for them to create event subscriptions. It's hard for them to evolve our serverless thinking because they're
Right.
so far removed from it. I still think it was the right call in the end. I think this is the next step of the journey is
Right.
figuring
Right.
out how do we share code effectively while not hiding away too much of serverless, especially because it's changing so fast.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And
it's also interesting though that you take that approach to hide some of that complexity and bake in some of that boilerplate that someone's most likely going to have to write themselves anyways. And like you said, the copying pasting between services is not the best way to do it. I tried the whole shared packages thing one time, and it kind of worked. It's just like when you make a small change to that package and you have like 14 services that then you have to update to get the newest version.
yeah.
Sometimes that's a little frustrating. Lambda layers haven't been a huge help with some of that stuff either. But anyways, it's interesting because again, you've mentioned this a number of times about using queues, and you did
Mhm.
mention resiliency in there. But I want to touch on that point a little bit because that's one of those things too where I would assume in a banking platform, you do not want to lose events, right? You don't want to lose
Mhm.
things. And so if something breaks or something gets throttled or whatever, having to go and retry those events, having the alerts in place to know that a queue is backed up or whatever. And then just, I mean, I'm thinking ordering issues and things like that. What kinds of issues did you face? And tell me a little bit more about what you've done for reliability.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, queues are definitely like SQS is a workhorse for our company right now. We use a lot of it, and I think we do like just dropping messages is one of the scariest things. So you're dead on there. When we were moving to event driven, that was what scared me the most. Like, what if we drop an event?
Hmm.
And like a good example of that is if you're using EventBridge and you're subscribing Lambdas to it. I was under the impression early on that EventBridge retries forever. But I'm pretty sure it'll retry until it invokes twice. I think that's what we landed on. And so an
Oh,
example,
interesting. Okay.
I think so. And so don't quote me on this, but we had to. That was like an example of where a drop message could be a problem, and we put a queue in front of there, an SQS queue as the subscription there. So that way, if there's any failure to deliver there, it's just going to retry like all the time for n number of days.
Right.
And so at that point, we got to think about DLQs, and that's something we're still sort of thinking about. But yeah, I think like the reason we've been using queues everywhere is that now queues are in charge of all your retriability. So now that we've decomposed these lambdas into, like one lambda into five lambdas
Hmm.
with queues in between, if anything fails in there, it just pops back into the queue and it'll retry
Yeah.
um, sort of indefinitely. But yeah, you can drop messages after a few days, and that's something we learned luckily in the prototyping stage, where there are a few places where we use dead letter queues. But one of the issues there as well was ordering. So ordering didn't play too well with with the
Not
dead
with
letter
not with
queues.
DLQs. No, it does not.
Yeah.
No.
And so I think that's like one lesson I'd want to share is that only use ordering when you absolutely need it. So
Hmm.
we found ways to design some of our architecture where we didn't need ordering. Like there's places we were using FIFO SQS, which was something that sort of just launched when we were building this thing. So when we were
Hmm.
thinking about messaging, we're like, oh, well, we can't use SQS because they don't respect ordering or doesn't respect ordering. And then bam, like the next day we see this blog article. And so we got really hyped on that and used FIFO everywhere and then realized it's unnecessary in most use cases. So when we were going live, we actually changed those FIFO queues into just regular SQS queues in as many places as we can. And then so in that use case, you could really easily attach a dead letter queue and you don't have to worry about anything. But with FIFO, things get really gnarly. And
Right.
so yeah, ordering is an interesting one. Another place we got burned, I think, on dead letter queues or tough thing to do with dead letter queues is when we were using our state machines, we needed to limit the concurrency of our state machines. Is another wish list item in AWS. I wish there was just a at the top of the file like a limit concurrent executions
Mm.
of your state machine, and maybe it exists, and maybe we just didn't learn to use it properly. But we needed to. There's a few patterns out there. Like I've seen the semaphore pattern where you can use the actual state machine flow to look back at how many concurrent executions you have and sort of pause. We
Right.
landed on setting reserved concurrency in a number of lambdas and throwing errors if we've hit the max concurrency, and it'll sort of pause that lambda. But the problem with DLQs there was these are all errors. So they're coming back as errors. we're like, we're fine with them. This is a throttle error. That's
Yeah.
fine. Um, but it's hard to distinguish that from a poison message in your queue. And so when do you dump those into DLQ? So if it's just a throttling thing, I don't think it matters to us. And so that was like another challenge we had.
Mhm.
So we're still figuring out dead letter queues and alerting. I think for now, we just relied on CloudWatch alarms a lot for our alerting.
Yeah.
And there's a lot you could do. So even just in the state machines, you could get pretty granular there and know when certain things fail and sort of announce to your Slack
Yeah.
channel. So we use that Slack integration. It's pretty easy. You just go on a Slack channel. There's an email in there. You plop it into the console in AWS, and you're kind of you have your very early alerting like
Right.
mechanism there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and so the thing with Elasticsearch, not Elasticsearch. I'm sorry, I'm totally off topic here. So the thing with EventBridge and Lambda, like these are one of those things that again they're nuances, but EventBridge, as long as it can deliver to the Lambda service, then the Lambda service kicks off and queues it automatically. And then that will retry it a certain number of times. And I think you can control that now. But then eventually, if that retries multiple times and eventually fails, then that kicks it over to the DLQ or whatever. So yeah, there's all different ways that it works like that. But that's why I always like the idea of putting a queue in between there as well, because I felt like you just had a little bit more control over exactly what happens. Like as long as it gets to the queue, then you know you haven't lost the message, or you hope you haven't lost the message. Hi, everyone. I want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Lumigo. We've talked a lot about observability on this podcast, and if you've listened to any of those episodes, then you know that it can be difficult to achieve serverless observability with traditional approaches. Now, though serverless comes with many opportunities and advantages, it also has some unique issues that some tools just aren't able to address, and those issues really need something meant for serverless environments. Now, that's where Lumigo comes in. As a serverless-first monitoring platform, Lumigo lets developers quickly and easily find and fix errors and performance issues, while also giving you an end-to-end view of the entire transaction across services and functions. All of the debugging information you need is conveniently in one place, and you're able to set up alerts so that you know what's happening and how it might affect the user experience. Lumigo also knows how to play nice with your existing toolchain, enabling you to send alerts to email, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Opsgenie, and more, and can also create tickets in Jira straight from the issues page. Thanks to their automatic distributed tracing, it only takes 4 clicks to set up Lumigo with no manual code changes necessary. Lumigo already has a free plan that lets you track up to 150,000 AWS Lambda invocations a month, but today they're offering Serverless Chats listeners a special promotion. Sign up for a free account at lumigo.io and enter promo code CHATS500, and your free account limit will go up to 500,000 monthly invocations. That's lumigo.io with promo code CHATS500 to try it out today. Let's move on a little bit about the adoption issues. You mentioned a few of these things, obviously issues with, concurrency and ordering and some of that other stuff. What about some of the other, sort of challenges you had? You mentioned this, this idea of writing all these packages, and it kind of pulls devs away from the CloudFormation a little bit. I do like that in that I think it accelerates a lot of things, but, what are some of the other maybe challenges that you've been having just getting this thing up and running?
Yeah. So I would say IAM is an interesting one. So because we are in the banking space, you want to be very careful about what access do you give to what machines or developers. I think machines are important too. And so there have been cases where, so we do have a separate developer setup with their own permissions. And so in development, it's really easy to spin up all your services within reason. But now when we're going into production, there's times where our CI doesn't have the permissions to delete a queue or create a queue or certain things. And there's like a lot of tweaking you have to do there. And you got to do a lot of thinking about your IAM policies as an organization, especially because now every developer's touching infrastructure. So that becomes sort of this shared operational overhead that serverless did introduce. And so we're still figuring that out. So right now we're functioning on least privilege. So it's better to just not be able to deploy than deploy something you shouldn't or read logs that you shouldn't. And that's where we're starting. But that's something that well, it will be a challenge for a little while, I think. And there's all kinds of interesting things out there. Like I think temporary IAM permissions is a really cool one. So there are times where we're in production and we need to view certain logs
Mhm.
or be able to access a certain queue. And there's tooling out there where you can, or at least so I've heard, you can give temporary permissions. You
Mhm.
have this queue permission for 30 minutes and it expires and it's audited, and I think there's like some CloudTrail tie-in you could do there. And I'm speaking about the my wish list for our next evolution here. So I hope
No,
my
that's
team
your
listening
team's listening
will
to you. Yeah.
will be
Well,
inspired as well.
right. So what about because this is something too that I always found to be a challenge, especially when you start having multiple services, and you talked about these domain events, but then milestone events. So you've got different services that need to communicate across services or across domains, and realize certain things like that. And so service discovery in and of itself, and like which queue are we mapping to, or which
Mm.
service am I talking to, and which version of the service am I talking to, things like that. That's how have you been dealing with that stuff?
Not well, I would
Okay.
say. Like very, very ad hoc. I think like right now, at least we have tight communication between the teams, so we roughly
Hmm.
know which service we need to talk to,
Right,
and
right.
we output our URLs in the CloudFormation output, so at least you could reference the URLs across services a little easier. Well, really, GraphQL is like one of the only service that really um, talks to a lot of our API gateways.
Yeah.
So at least there's like less of that, like knowing which endpoint to hit. Most of our services will read into EventBridge, and then within services, um, a lot of that's abstracted away. Like the queue subscription is a little easier.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I mean, service discovery is a bit of a nightmare. Like once once our services grow, it'll be a I don't know, it'll be a huge challenge to understand like even which versions, which services are using older versions of Node, for instance.
Right.
I saw that AWS is now deprecating version 10, and
Right. Yep.
we'll have to take a look at internally, like, are we using version 10 anywhere, and how do we make sure that's fine, or even things like just knowing which services now have vulnerabilities in their npm packages because we're using Node, and that's another thing. And I don't even know if that falls in service discovery, but it's sort of in this overhead
Right. No.
of
Yeah, I mean, it's just
services.
service management too. I mean, it's a huge is a lot there, and that actually maybe brings me to this idea of observability too. So you mentioned doing some CloudWatch alerts and some of that stuff, but what about like using some sort of observability tool or tracing like X-ray and things like that? Have you been implementing any of that? And if you have you had any success and or problems with it?
Yeah, I wish we had a better view of some of the observability tools. I think we were just building so quickly that we never really invested the time into trying them out. So we did
Mm,
use X-ray, and so we sort of rolled our um, own tooling internally to at least do what we know. So X-ray was one of those, but the problem with X-ray is we do subscribe all of our services, but it's not X-ray isn't implemented everywhere internally in AWS. So we lose our trail somewhere in that Dynamo stream to SNS or SQS. So it's not a full trace.
yeah,
Also, just digesting that huge graph of information is just very difficult.
yeah.
I don't use it often. I think it's a really cool graphic to show, like, hey, look how many services are running, and it's going so fast. Like, it's a really cool thing to look at, but it hasn't been very useful. And so I think our most useful tool for debugging and observability has been just our logging. So we created a JSON logger package, and so we could have JSON logs, and we could actually filter off of different properties,
Yep.
and we ship those to Elasticsearch. So now you can have a view of all of the functions within a given domain at any point in time. And so you could really see this story. So I think early on, when we were opening up CloudWatch and you'd have like 10 tabs and you're
Right.
trying to understand this flow of information, it was very difficult. And so we also implemented our own trace ID pattern, and I think we just followed a Lumigo article where we introduced some properties in each of
Right.
our lambdas sort of at a higher level in one of our middlewares, and we're able to trace through. It's not ideal. observability is something that we'll probably have to work on next. It's been tolerable for now, but I can't see the scaling that
Right.
long.
Yeah.
You know, if we
Well, that's
did,
the other thing too, is even like the shared package issue. It's like when you have an observability tool, like, they'll just install a layer or something, where you don't necessarily have to worry about updating your own tool. And I always find if you're embracing serverless and you want to get rid of all that undifferentiated heavy lifting, observability tools, there's a lot of really good ones out there that are doing some great stuff, and they're specializing in it. So it's sort of like it might be worth letting someone else handle that for you than trying to do it yourself internally.
yeah, 100%. I mean, do you have any that you've used that are particularly good?
Yeah,
I know
I
you
mean,
work for
I've
serverless,
played
so
around. I've played around with all of them, because I love this stuff, so it's
Mm,
always fun. But I mean, obviously, Lumigo and Epsagon and Thundra and New Relic. I mean, they're all great. They all do things slightly differently, but they all kind of follow a similar implementation pattern, so that it's very easy to install them. But yeah, I mean, we can talk more about some recommendations, but yeah, no, I think it's just one of those things where in a modern application, not having that insight is really hard. It can be really hard to debug stuff. If you look at some of the tools that AWS offers, I think they're there. It's just they're maybe a little harder to implement and not quite as refined and sort of targeted as some of the observability tools. But still, I mean, you got to get there, right? It's a, like, again, that's why I keep saying it's an evolution. It's a process. Once maybe one time you get burned and you're like, we really needed to have observability, then that's when it becomes more of a priority when you're moving fast like you are.
yeah, 100%. I think this has got to be a priority earlier than later. So I think I'll do some reading now. Now that you've dropped some of these options, I have seen them floating around, but
Right.
it's one of those things that when it's too late, it's too late. Like,
it's
I
never
don't
it's
know.
never too late to add observability though. So it
That is true.
actually, a lot of them now. I mean, again, it makes it really really easy. So I'm not trying to pitch any
Sure.
particular company, but like take a look at some of them that because they are really great. But so just one other challenge that I also find a lot of people run into, especially with serverless, because there's all these sort of artificial account limits in place.
Mm.
Even like the number of queues you can create and the number of concurrent Lambda functions in a particular region and stuff like that. Have you run into any of those account limit issues?
Yeah, yeah. I could give you the easiest way to run into an account limit issue, and that is replay your entire EventBridge archive to every subscriber, and you will find a bottleneck somewhere.
Right,
And so
somewhere
that's
it'll
something
it'll fall over.
like
Nice.
100%. I mean, it's a good way to do some quick check in development to see where you might need to buffer something, but we have run into that, and I think like the solution there in a lot of places was just really playing with concurrency where we needed to and being thoughtful about reserving concurrency in places that we absolutely needed to
Right.
stay functioning. And I think the
Yeah.
challenge there is that eats into your total account
Right.
concurrency, which was an interesting learning there.
Yeah.
So um, but yeah, definitely like playing around there and just being thoughtful about where you are replaying. So a couple of things. We use replays a lot. So because we are using these milestone events between service boundaries, now when you launch a new service, you want to replay that whole history
Right.
all the
Right.
way through. And so we've done a lot of replaying, and that was one of the really cool things about EventBridge. It just was so easy. You just set up an archive and
Yep.
it'll
Yep.
record everything coming through, and then you you know just press a button in the console and it'll replay all of them. So
Yeah.
that was really awesome. But just yeah, being very mindful of where you're replaying to. So if you replay to all of your subscriptions,
Right.
you'll hit Lambda concurrency limits real quick. And even just like another case, early on, we needed to replay. So we have our own domain event store, and so
Yep.
we want to replay some of those events, and those are coming off the Dynamo stream. And so we were using Dynamo to kick those to a stream, to SNS, and fan out to all of our SQS queues. But there would only be like one or two queues we actually needed to subscribe to those events. So we created an internal utility just to dump those events directly into the SQS queue
Oh, nice.
we needed. So
Yep.
I think it's just about not being wasteful with
Mm.
your resources because they are cheap,
Right.
sure,
But if you
but
use them, they start to cost money. So that's the
yeah,
other
they,
thing
they
too.
start to cost money as well as they could lock down, like they could lock you out of other functionality. So
Right.
if you hit your Lambda limits, now our API gateway is down. And
Yeah,
so,
right. That's a good point. Yep,
yeah, and
absolutely.
so you could take down your whole system if you just aren't mindful about those limits. And now you could call up AWS in a panic and be like, hey, can you update our limits? Luckily, we haven't had to do that yet, but it's definitely something in your back pocket if you need it.
Right.
You can make the case to AWS that maybe you do need bigger limits than the default. Um, but yeah, I think just not being wasteful, being mindful of where you're replaying, and I think another interesting thing there is dealing with partners too. So it's
Mm,
really easy to scale in the Lambda world, but not every partner could handle that kind of volume really quickly.
right.
So if you're not buffering any event coming through EventBridge um, to your new service that hits a partner every time, you're going to hit their API rate limit really quickly
Pretty
because they're
fast.
just
Yeah.
going to like just go right through. So you might be doing thousands of API calls when you're instantiating a new service. And so that's one of those interesting things that we have to deal with. And particularly in our orchestrators, because they are talking to different partners, that's why we need to really make sure we could limit the concurrent executions of the state machines themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, yeah, so in a way, some of our architecture is too fast to scale. You still have to
It's too
consider
good.
downstream. And that, and even just if you are using relational databases or anything else in your system, now you have to worry about connection limits and
I have a whole talk
spikes
I
in
give on
traffic.
that. Yes,
Oh,
absolutely.
really cool.
I know all about it. So, is there any final advice for companies like you that are trying to bite off a piece of the serverless apple? I guess that's really bad saying, but anyways, any advice for people looking to get into this?
Yeah, totally. I would say start small. I think
Mm,
we were wise to just try it out. It might not land with your development team. If you don't really buy in, it's one of those things that could just end up unnecessarily messy. So
right.
start small, see if you like it, inch up, and then reevaluate once you hit a certain point. That, and I would say shared boilerplate packages sooner than later. I know like shared code is a problem, but it is nice to have an opinionated starter pack
Yeah.
that you're at least not doing anything really crazy. Yeah, and just even just things like having opinions around logging, like in our industry, it's really important you're not logging sensitive details. So
Right.
for us, doing things like wrapping our HTTP clients to make sure we're not logging sensitive details, or having shared Lambda packages that make sure out of the box, you're opinionated about not doing something terribly awful.
Right.
And so, yeah, I would say those two things: start small and boiler package. And maybe the third thing is just as just pay attention to the code smell of a growing Lambda. If
Yeah.
you are doing three API calls in one Lambda, chances are you could probably break that up and think about it in a more resilient way. If any one of those pieces fail, now you could have retriability in each one of those. And yeah, so yeah, those are the three things I would say. And I could probably talk forever about the rest of our journey.
Well, that was I think that was great advice, and I love hearing about how companies are going through this process, what that process looks like, and I hope that companies listen to this and can skip a lot of these mistakes. I think it's and I don't want to call them all mistakes, and I think it's just evolution, right? Like the stuff that you've done, we've all made them, we've all gone through that process, the more we can sort of solidify these practices and stuff like that, I think that more companies will benefit from hearing stories like these. So thank you very much for sharing that. So again, thank you so much for spending the time to do this and sharing all of this knowledge and this journey that you've been on and are continuing to be on. It would be great to continue to get updates from you. So if people want to contact you, I know you're not on Twitter, but what's the best way to sort of reach out to you?
Yeah, I almost wish I had a Twitter. It's the developer thing to have, so maybe in the future. But yeah, just on LinkedIn would be great. And yeah, LinkedIn would be great, as well as if anybody's interested in working with our team and just figuring out how to take serverless to the next level, just hit me up on LinkedIn or look at our careers page at northone.com
Awesome.
and I could give you a warm intro.
That's great. So just your last name is spelled Strzelec. How do you say that again? Because I know say it in Polish, because I know I said it wrong in the beginning.
Yeah, so I guess for most people it'd just be Strzelec, but if you there are any Slavs in the audience, it's Strzelec. Very intense four consonant last name.
That is a lot of consonants. So anyways, again, Patrick, thanks again. This was great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeremy. This has been awesome.
And that's this week's Serverless Chat. I want to give a huge thank you to Patrick Strzelec for being my guest this week, and to our sponsors CBT Nuggets and Lumigo. If you want to check out the show notes and a full transcript of this episode, you can find them at serverlesschats.com/105. For more Serverless Chat, subscribe, sign up to be an insider, check us out on YouTube, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can connect with me on Twitter at Jeremy_Daily, and if you want to keep up to date on everything serverless, make sure you subscribe to the Off by None newsletter at offbynone.io. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to chatting with all of you again next week.